Okay, there's the live. Hi, I'm Paul Bass, and thank you for joining us with Sacred Music. Here we're talking with Professor Carol. This is part of the Sacred Music course that's available on professorcarol.com. To those of you who are members, thank you, and to those of you who are watching this via YouTube, make sure you go check it out. They have more than that. They have a lot of courses there that they're just rich, and you won't even know what I mean by rich unless you go and check it out. So do that, and welcome, Professor Carol.
Welcome to you as our wonderful host. We're so happy you can be with us every time. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I enjoy doing this. Now, let me just say, today we are talking about, well, go ahead and tell us, what are we talking about today?
Well, as we progress through the weekly topics, because we more or less recommend for people that are doing this course, you can do it any way you want on any time schedule. You can take your spring break and do nothing but one of our courses. That would keep you pretty busy. But we know some people that have put it into a shorter time frame, maybe not spring break, of course, but sometimes people will do our courses in what you might call a mini-mester or a interterm semester, especially if we have high school students who need to get some credits, before that graduation date. But at any rate, depending on whatever schedule you like to do these courses in Circle of Scholars, most people tend to go a unit a week. That seems to be the norm. So this week, if you want to look at it that way, the material was focused largely on an important aspect of monastic life, the development of early Christian history, and what we call in a single term, the offices, thinking about how that cycle of 8 daily prayer services fits within a person's life within a cloistered community, and what its content is, and what that has to say to us about the history of early sacred music.
Okay. So, in your career with this research, you've been doing this for quite some time. You have visited quite a few monasteries, is that correct?
Well, I didn't get to start doing this kind of work because it was not what I began with as a pianist. I'm a pianist who's thinking like most kids when they're growing up, and they're good, and they think, oh, I'm going to be in Carnegie Hall and but life takes you in a different direction. And then my initial work was all on Soviet and Russian music, and then teaching in my early part of my years as a professor, I was teaching whatever needed to be taught, courses on Mozart opera and on Broadway and on the history of American music and all these other things that one does, seminars on Beethoven. So it took a long time before I could get a focus in my own work on this early music topic. And it is so helpful when you can see and be in a place where this is not an academic subject. This is a daily way of life. So that's a lot of preface to say that my very first experience in a monastic setting was about 1987, and boy, started it out with a bang. We were in Croatia, starting in Zagreb, and I was with some longtime friends who were senior Croatian Academy of Science musicologists, and they were on a project called RILM, which was an acronym for a massive international project that went around to places like cathedral libraries, and not just cathedral libraries, but monastic settings and old city hall archives, and any place where you would find stacks and stacks of old valuable manuscripts or music. And RILM had many, many people involved. My friends Stanislav and Vera, they were going monastery by monastery through the great riches in the Adriatic. So that part of what was then Yugoslavia, today mostly Croatia, which had been part of the Holy Roman Empire, certainly part of the Catholic world, as Christianity spread, and was filled with monasteries of every order you can practically think of. So we literally, that's really how I got my start, was by hanging with them one summer and traveling with them. And I have to tell you, Paul, you know how we traveled to most of them?
Yeah. How's that?
Not by a Greyhound bus, by rowboat. Well, I
Really?
think we had some motorboats too. I don't remember. And I'm not such a big water person. I'm better now. And I remember we drove, and you know what that part of the world's like? It's like Greece. You have these cliffs, and we were in a little tiny European Soviet era car. I have no idea what it was, but it didn't feel so very solid. It was like, oh, if I ever get through this, I will never do this again. One of those times. But they were completely relaxed about it, and the cliffs looking right down to the Adriatic, and I would look over and go, oh, I think I'll just sit back and close my eyes now. So anyway, we got to where we're going, but then we're not really yet where we're going, because a lot of these monasteries are on islands, that aren't so very far off the coast, but they're off the coast. So we would, in some cases, literally get in a little boat, and I guess we putted over. I was trying to just be really cool. And then we come to this little island and pulled our boat up and grabbed our backpacks and our materials and walked right into the reception area of the monastery, where they were expected, by the way. And so that was a way to go to work, wasn't it?
Wow.
I'll never forget that. I remember thinking, okay, how many times have people done this over the centuries? And of course, as a female, in terms of monastic male monasteries, because there's cloistered women as well, convents.
Yeah.
But that term monastery can be very general, but in the settings of the Benedictines, etc., there were limits, obviously, to where I and Vera could be, which parts. I mean, there's always a reception area, and many monasteries are very welcoming of guests. They may have a wing for guests. There's places where you can join for services. There's even sometimes, depending on the monastery, depending on the order, communal or places where you can come for meals. Not the most cloistered sections, but nonetheless, so it can be very welcoming. But nonetheless, there are many, many. You're very aware that these are, number one, cloistered situations in terms of everybody, but also very much as women, there are very specific places where our presence is appropriate and where it's not, So that was all. You have to understand, this was all academic to me before. And suddenly, there we were, rowboat and all, right there
Wow.
in the ancient world. And those experiences, I have never forgotten a minute of them. I don't want to go too much on this, but I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I was staggered by almost every single thing. How warm and friendly and inviting, how differently we were, the procedures were at the Franciscan versus the Benedictine versus the different, and it just turned my head inside out. And I think that's good when that happens in our education.
Yeah. Well, is there any sense in which, well, that monastery, do you have any idea if there have been any changes, since Europe has had a lot of changes?
Oh, I wouldn't
Since
think so.
87.
Yeah. No, I imagine the boat probably got, maybe they got a new
Yeah.
boat. That was 87. No, that's the thing. This world is, of course, one of the big changes is a lot of monasteries have put in the internet, especially if they run schools and they're teaching Jesuits, who, of course, very often are teaching orders, and they will have boys' schools. I remember we went to one monastery. It was not on an island because it'd be hard to get those boys to school, right? But it was on the mainland there, on the coast, and I'd have to think back to my records of which little town. And they had it was a Jesuit order, and they had a lovely boys' school and the ancient buildings, with all the cobblestones and the old steps and crawling. And we got there just as school was out, and these little boys, all in their little school uniforms, they came flying out, as little boys always do out of school, and it was like poof. It was okay, but I'll never forget that, because the building looked so quiet and staid, and then all of a sudden out came all these little boys, and one is reminded that these are living, breathing institutions carrying on ancient traditions. Not, when I say ancient, not Greece and Rome, but Jesuit is Counter-Reformation times, so that's modern in some respect, but still very old in terms of our American mindset. So that was one I won't ever forget. And then, I don't know which monk met us, but he was apologizing for the boys, and I said, no, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. He said, you know how they are when they leave school. I guess everybody was speaking Italian. I have no idea what we were speaking, but sort of an international world too. It was really, really formative. It took it off the page. It took it and made it so real. I still didn't understand it all, but I knew it was alive. I knew it was ongoing.
Well, what is the most ancient one that you were able to visit?
I think perhaps at Split, I'd have to look back. Dubrovnik, perhaps. I'd have to look at. There was a little island that may have been the oldest. Again, that's a very good question that I'll have the answer for next time if I look it up, because again, the orders. Of course, when you talk about orders, you're talking about the Benedictines and Saint Benedict and the rule of Saint Benedict, which is that going back into basically certainly by 530, I believe would be they don't know what day exactly he formulated all this simple, we would call it a booklet of
Mm.
rules that organize monastic life, and not the first monasteries, because we've talked about the ancient the holy men going to the deserts and everything. But when you start organizing a community, you've got to have rules, and setting up the abbot, setting up everything from meals and living quarters and habits, and not habits, things we do, but what monks will wear, which of course has changed somewhat depending on climate. You're going to, in the southern Mediterranean, the habit's going to be different than in New England, or in Canada, right, because of weather. But all of those issues are handled, and St. Benedict's rule became, it wasn't the only organizational policy, but it became this sort of prototype for organizations of cloistered life that to this day, and if you are a Benedictine following that rule is just as live in your life, that compare it to, I'm trying to think what it would be compared to, but a code of behavior that answers all the questions before they're asked. And so it's always, in a good code of ethics, there's always an answer to everything before it's asked. So things run relatively smoothly. And so you have to say the Benedictine order, in its heritage and preservation of manuscripts and in so many ways, is just so critical to our early Christian tradition.
I'd love to read that booklet. I would assume, is it available to download on Amazon or anything like that?
Oh, it's available many ways, and if you
Yeah.
now, Paul, if you've done your homowork for that unit,
Yeah,
I realize
right.
you have a family to raise and a life and all the work you do, but all those of our students who are doing this assignment, they have some. We take you to a very good site explaining, not just giving you the rules, but
Mm.
actually helping us analyze, because we read something about a very specific detail about life or food habits, from the 6th century. We don't necessarily know why, but it was always practical. It was sort of like the kind of practicality. If it were today and it were, let's say, in the Chicago area, it would be things like always have rock salt for the winter. We may need to we need to put some down when things freeze. I mean, it was some of it was spiritual, of course, about prayer and fasting, and rules of silence, which are very, very periods of silence. I mean, some monastic orders are completely in silence, with almost no exceptions. Some have the periods of silence, and we send our students in this assignment to several video excerpts that are beautifully done, that explain monastic life, both from the monasteries for the men and the convents for the women, including internationally. So I think it's very helpful. I'm so grateful for all these YouTube resources. I just think we are a visual age, plus we want to see things in our time. We want to see things. And so I think these orders that bring in little documentary film crews and let these daily cycles be filmed, they're really doing a great service to help people understand the life of those who are called to that vocation.
I have to laugh because you were, when I went with you to St. Louis, and you had told me about having a meal with the monks while it was in silence, I believe you mentioned. And then it was a little bit different when I was there, because they had an event and it was not one of those times of silence. And I just remember I was expecting, some sort of meal that they prepared, and it was from Steak and Shake. So Hank and I got to have burgers with Benedictines. So
Yeah,
and
that's what.
but it worked out good for me because I had so many questions, and they were very gracious. But I didn't get to have that little no talking time, that I was expecting. I guess I was afraid of that, and it didn't happen, so it made me feel good.
Well, again, the very fact St. Louis Abbey has been so helpful for everybody who's taken this course. You've gotten to know some of the members of that order through the various monks who were so gracious to answer our questions. Father Gregory, Father Bede, Father Abbott. You've come to know them in this course, and Father Timothy. It's just so lovely that they brought their lifetimes of understanding. In the case of Father Timothy, decades and decades and decades and decades of understanding to share with us. And the very fact that it's a monastery in an urban setting on gorgeous grounds. They run a wonderful classical academy there for boys, and that there are certain occasions where members of their parish, including the women who help to cook these meals. Sometimes we didn't have steak and shake or whatever we had. I forget, but it was beautiful casserole. And sometimes women are invited in that setting. It's all very different, depending on many things, but to come to it. It was great honor, and it gets very. There's no one way, and there's many subtleties about all of this. But the thing is, it's always clear. It's always so clear. At least that's one of the things I take from it: the clarity of the monastic life, because it is ordered by prayer. It is ordered by praise.
Very good. And if I can, I don't have a very good segue, but I would like to talk about the music, because that's what a lot of people think about, is the chant that goes on. And unless you've experienced it in person, it's a different idea. It's, we have recordings of it, but to be in there and have the sound just bouncing back and forth off of the walls and everything, it's just, live music, recorded music, but the chant is just, it's an experience. And so can we talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes, because and that's at the understanding chant in some way. It's people say, what was your most important objective in creating this course? And I think helping people understand, as I have come to understand, the vitality, the power, the worship power, the prayerful power, the life transitional power of chant, the enlightenment that comes from a life of chant. That's really at the basis of much of what we're doing in this course, and to see the history and all the different people who unfold across those centuries of history and how it shaped modern Europe back then, and even modern Europe today, quite frankly. But and in the traditions that have continued to influence life. But chant, as we've covered in a lot of our units, we've established how natural it is to sing, and all the expressive and acoustical reasons for singing, and some of the methods of singing. And we're going soon to be moving into the period of Charlemagne, and I think that's actually coming up very soon, and how chant becomes codified into pretty standard repertoires that will be used more or less across a wide area. And all of that historical information is fascinating. But when it gets right down to it, if you're following the daily offices, as monastic orders do, and some other people do, there are individuals who do to a certain degree, but monastic orders, then that means your entire day is about coming into a communal, relatively short service where you pray and you praise, and you do it through singing. And whether it's being done in English or it's being done in Latin, or some combination, depending, it doesn't matter. The fact is, your day is organized technically every 3 hours by a service of worship or prayer. Now, in reality, it's tweaked a little bit, and certainly when you read even St. Benedict's rule, and there's discussion about, well, what happens to the monks that have to plow the fields? Or I always think about birthing animals, if you're assisting with the birthing of the spring kids or calves, right, or lambs, the bell rings, but you need to be there so that those baby animals, or to help those baby animals sometimes be delivered safely or whatever. There are certainly all kinds of exclusions, because the monastery has a business always. It has to run. It has to produce food. Maybe they do their business by making cheese and selling it in the community, even today. Or they're copyists. But always those human needs are either interwoven into the cycle of 8 daily prayer services, of which we call the daily offices, or they are I said they're either interwoven or they have to be put aside, because the number one job of a monk is to pray without ceasing, to pray, to be in those communal points of regular, completely all-encompassing worship that is conducted through singing these in irreplaceably important scriptural passages and texts and prayers, with the chant.
Okay. Well, I have 3 questions.
Oh, okay.
All right. Okay. We talk about Gregorian chant. Who is the Gregory referred to that? And should we even be using that term? And are there other types of chant other than Gregorian chant?
Okay, well, those are good questions. Well, St. Gregory there was a Pope Gregory, Gregory the First, Gregory the Great, did a lot of very important things. You can read about him a lot, and it's from his name that we take this idea of Gregorian chant. And it's always a disappointment for students to find out. I remember learning it long ago, as a freshman. I can't even imagine when or where. I guess that's when I first realized it. He didn't really sit down and write all those pieces, those beautiful melodies. From the legendary explanation and the spiritual kind of story of Gregory, he was, and that's the beauty of icons, by the way, and of these saintly legends. There's the reality that Gregory did not grab a piece of music paper and sit down and scribble these melodies. Well, I don't know, maybe he did, but I don't want to go into the discussion. But when you see the icon, it's so beautiful, because what you see is the dove, the Holy Spirit, whispering into Gregory's ear and inspiring him to these chant melodies. And as I say, you can debate whether that's what happened, but from the musical and historical standpoint, that's not really our issue at all, and especially in this course. But what we do know that Gregory did was that he put enormous emphasis on not only chant and its power, but in organizing it and codifying it. Now, that's Charlemagne's going to do a lot more a few centuries later, right? But in making it be at the core of the ever-developing liturgical practices, and in standardizing the entire approach. Standardizing things in the arts is really important. It's important in anything. What if every screwdriver or every nut or bolt had its own, odd size? And in one village, a tool, a ratchet or something, things were one size. You go to the next village, they're another size. The next village, another. You can't have a coherent building program. People can't travel and still apply their trades. Getting the standard measurements down is important. Getting the standardized tuning will be important when we get into what we'll call the Baroque period, where you go, where things are tuned to certain pitches that are more or less the way they are elsewhere. Standard way that you build a keyboard for music, even the width of the keys or the length of the keys, all this takes time. But getting things standardized is a real modern undertaking in our Western cultural history, so that once it's standardized, it can be more powerful, it can be spread, it can be solidified, it can be used, it can be increased. So Gregory is absolutely, you should be calling it Gregorian chant. Now, technically, we probably got that beaten out of us in music history class real fast. We called it plain chant. I'm sure that was what we were told on our test. Gregorian chant should properly be called plain chant. Which is fine. I mean, that's one chant, one term that's used. Call it plain chant, it's fine. But I think for people to call it Gregorian chant is just fine and just great. And it's something people, when they hear Gregorian chant, they hear a sound in their ears. And then the other question was about whether there are other bodies of chant repertoire. And the answer, there certainly were, and there will remain, and there still are other bodies, historical and not so historical, of chant. Sarum and Mozarabic, and these get into a little more detail from a musicological standpoint. But remember, chant gets standardized through a lot of Europe, certainly in Charlemagne's time, but that doesn't cover all of North Africa. That doesn't cover, so there are many, many regions in the world with chant traditions, and some of those were very strong, are very beautiful, and had a lot of influence on the development of chant.
Okay, in your many, many regions where chant exists, is it always a cappella? That may be a stupid question, but is it?
No. And that's a great question. Of course, in the eastern lung of the Christian Church, the Eastern Orthodox, which we think of as Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, always in Russian, it's a cappella or without instruments. There are traditions that you find in some of the Greek Church where there is in the United States that I've experienced, where people bring a little organ support in. But technically in Greece, technically Eastern Christian chant is without accompaniment, voices only, a cappella, head, capital, right? Decapitate, if you will, a cappella. So yes, it is a cappella, and even as it develops when we get to around 1400, or sooner than that, actually, we'll be talking about the beginning. After Charlemagne, we'll start talking actually with our students about the beginning of 2 melodies and 3 melodies simultaneously, which we call polyphony. But that will be enhancement on the vocal single line chant in some very, very interesting ways. It will remain without instruments.
Okay, very good. Well, I had to know that because, when what was it, the late 80s, when, there was a little bit of pop success with a chant album. Do you remember that?
Well, right. Well, now you're asking whether
When they
modern.
put it to music.
Oh, yeah. And of course, chant is going to, I mean, the chant melodies, we need to think of them as massively important and powerful ingredients. How composers will choose to set them, especially outside of liturgical situations, and how in the last several hundred years of Christianity, people have decided to frame chant and use chant and accompany chant. And in many churches, you will find people adding accompany, that is a very, very different story. When you get into the modern time, the last several centuries, okay, and certainly, when we get in our 12th and final session of this course, we'll be talking to you about settings of chant, not some liturgical and some not liturgical, meaning external or not secular, but for the concert world, if you will, or within the church in some cases where there's beautiful settings of modern context with chant melodies. We could, we will be bringing a lot of that in and sending our students to hear some of that as well. But that's now, and now remember, modern means 1600 and on, right? Modern from our standpoint as music historians is the last 3 or 4 centuries, not the last 10 or 20 years, right? We want
Right.
But when we're talking about this initial through the medieval period where, and that doesn't also mean as the organ develops, and we'll be speaking about this in one of our sessions, the early organs, which were small. Organs are old. They go back to the Greeks. Water organs, maybe I've said that already, hydrolysis, they've been around. The idea of running something, with pressure through a pipe to sound, that's old archaeological stuff, right? But that whether people use a couple of pitches to stabilize pitch or support the lower sounds, that certainly happened. There's no question about it. And we know that early organs were doubling the chant, providing musical support. All of that happens. It'll happen increasingly as we get into the Renaissance. But all of that is what happens. The chant is a cappella.
Okay. All right. Well, did the congregation sing the Gregorian chant or just the monks and the priests?
Well, and again, that's a great question, but it's also a huge question to answer. We can look at modern practice and who sings along. If you go to a monastery and you participate in the offices and you get there at the 5 a.m. or whatever, you're there, if you come to the compline or you come whichever, or you stop by for sext, it's some of these are not open to the public. Some are. Some of the more popular ones like matins will be done before morning mass in most modern American practices. Again, we've got to talk about where if there's a 7 o'clock mass, then people will come for the morning office or prayer service, and then they'll have their stay for morning mass, and then they'll go off to work. Again, people arrange things a lot of different ways in our modern society. And so in those cases, when people become familiar, but you got to remember, in the offices, the psalms are always changing. When we were in St. Louis Abbey, I'm sure you probably remember this being said, that they will go through the cycle of the psalms in the course of singing in the offices every 2 weeks, because there's certain psalms appropriate for certain days, and these texts are always changing. The melodies, though, are not. And people who attend, for the monks, this becomes like breathing. It doesn't take long. They'll know that psalter. They'll know these prayers. That music really just knits it into the mind, the soul, the brain, the heart completely. But if you go on a regular basis and attend, you will too become very familiar with these melodies, and you'll hear these psalms texts, and you're welcome to sing along. Now they're doing antiphonal. You mentioned that antiphone, back and forth. Often they're doing them antiphonally, and that's kind of tricky. It's not that tricky, but it takes a little bit of practice, you might say, to get that, or at least awareness to get that right. And Paul, there's nothing to stop any of us from singing our psalms in a chant form or our prayers. Nothing.
Right. Well, it's like you've mentioned. It goes goes, it predates the monasteries. You know,
Yes.
singing our prayers in a song. There was a great quote in one of your interviews in the course that I thought I'd bring out, and it's not really a question for you, but I just want to tell you I enjoyed it. And I don't remember who it was you were interviewing, but he talked about life in the monastery and compared it to Samuel in the temple sleeping next to the altar. And that's something that I hadn't thought of, and I thought that was a good picture of giving me, the outsider, an idea of why they like to be there, or at least why he likes to be there.
Yes, and this word of this, vocation is an interesting word because the more you have the opportunity to approach and understand, and some people, of course, depending on your background, we have all kinds of students, people and adults watching this with very different backgrounds. And if you're brought up in a strongly liturgical tradition, whether Western or Eastern, this is just normal life. You almost want to say, why don't people already know this? But if you're brought up, Paul, the way you and I were, you don't know these things. You learn them as you come along. And I think understanding vocation, and I think the excerpts we pick in our assignments are hopefully going to help people new to these traditions understand that monastics are called to a vocation. We have some interviews with people who were called out of, they were attorneys, they were in Hollywood, they were
Yeah.
the last, not everybody, some people know when they're 8. But for many people, it's something that comes to them as they mature. Maybe they're already professionals. Maybe events in life lead them to vocation. It is not a life that you just think, well, I wonder if I want to do this or that or that. A vocation is it's Samuel, as you say, not able to stay away from the altar, You might deny that calling, and there's many other ways. I'm sure you're familiar with many missionaries that who they may have fought that calling, right? But they couldn't keep fighting it because that voice was always calling them, right? And
Right.
finally, they have to heed that calling. And in terms of monastic life, it is a calling. It needs to be a calling because it is a life where you probably remember where I think it was Father Abbott from St. Louis Abbey was saying monks are called to give up many things, many good things,
Mm,
family. For example, the careers that are very good careers, other interests that one might have in doing creative work, research work, although monastics still carry on a lot of their personal interests, depending on what the situation is, if they wanted to write or whatever. But the point is, he said, we're called to give up good things, but we make that decision. And I'm paraphrasing him now. He said it much better. Forgive me, but because we are called to the very best thing, living a life completely and utterly devoted to God, to worship, to praise, to prayer. And I love how he said that. He said it way better than I said it. But I think it puts it in perspective. It's not running away from something or, all these other things are bad. It's making that step to live intensely within a constant cycle of worship and prayer and chanting and singing and praying that is your absolute focus of daily life, period.
yeah.
Every day.
He
That's
also
massive.
he also mentioned that he said you can't concentrate on everything, and I thought that was neat, and really bringing it down to that simplicity. And what are we talking about these days out there in popular culture? We're wanting to know about simplicity, and we seem to be intrigued by those who have sought it already or who found that simplicity. So that one caught me, where he said you can't concentrate on everything.
Oh boy, isn't that a key to our modern issues?
Yeah, when you've got so much around you, it does become rough when you try to concentrate. Believe me, when I have a computer in front of me, and a phone here that does this, and I mean, uh,
Yeah, we
let
just came from one of our big conventions, and there's just thousands of people and thousands of things and so much interesting going on. And you realize at the end of one of those days, and I know you have it in the broadcast world, you realize you're not sure if you've had a single thought that was your own the whole day. I mean, it's been gorgeous and glorious and so grateful for the opportunities, and you're inspired and you get all kinds of ideas. And then you think, I don't even know what you think after some of these days. And that's makes it hard, and that's where chant And these liturgical practices, this order of prayer, the fact that there will be first this psalm, and then there will be this canticle, and there will be this prayer, and then there will be this silence, and there will be this psalm, and there will be this, and after 11 minutes or 17 minutes or whatever the length of it's going to be, then you create this complete focus on God, listening to God, and you do it that much a day.
Right. And to
That is
modern,
the opposite.
right. And to modern senses, this cycle that you talk about, the daily offices, could seem, do you think that it could seem restrictive or even impractical?
Well, it is its goal and its aim is quite different from what we call practical.
Mhm.
And so I think in one of the clips, or I forget where this came up, but you'll find it said over and over. Um, People are very efficient in their work in monasteries because, again, think of where some of these are in the mountains, in the remote areas. They've got to get the food grown. They've got to get the hides tanned that are sold to get the money to supply the monastery with wood to burn in the ovens or whatever they're doing. That work has to be done so efficiently because there's so little time outside of prayer and worship to get it done. But of course the good thing is that people have figured out how to do it, and there's a lot of hands and young monks who do the heavy lifting, if you will, while the older monks may be more responsible for the liturgical duties because they've done their 20, 30, 40 years of heavy lifting. And see this community and working out the issues of community, and that realizing this has been, and this is what St. Benedict was doing with that rule, was knowing that when you have people focused in a community, we know that that requires a lot of negotiation and a lot of understanding of hierarchy and common goals. And so within the systems of monastic life, whether Eastern Christian or Western Christian, it's not impractical at all. It's the oxygen, it's the life-giving oxygen of what keeps the joy and the energy in monastic life. And there, without that, things would fall apart fast. And it is something else that was the first time I ever went. I don't think I got this so much in my first experience in the 80s, but later in the early 90s when I was going to Russia as a translator on various tours, etc., and had some situations to being. Well, maybe one time I got it in the late 80s in Russia, but I really got it later in the 90s when I left some monastic situations I was in convents situations I wouldn't have been in if I had not been translating, especially one in a convent because I was in some. I remember they were making the beeswax candles and seeing how that was done. I'll never forget how that smells. Oh, with the honey smell in the air. Anyway, but the point is I left, and when I left and went back out into the world, in the metros and people with their shopping bags and traffic, and I thought, wait a minute, they're going to be praying for all of us. All of us. It's all of us, in the middle of every place in the world, all of the time. And, no matter what your background, orientation, sense of all this is, there are people praying for us all the time. I found that exciting.
Wow, that is wow. Well, so you saw a lot in the Soviet Union, like during the time of the Soviet Union. Did you see a lot? Were the monasteries still in operation?
Some very famous ones, and the first times I was studying there, I was very restricted. We had distances. We were not allowed to travel more than about 15 miles, which would not allow us to go very far. And most of these places were in closed communities, and I can't even think what would have happened. I'm not going to say that I'm not going to say that I 100% followed that, but that was a long time ago. And if I happened to have had some opportunities that we don't need to get specific about, we can let that just sit there in the late 80s, okay? Or no, the early 80s. That was the early 80s, 81, 82. But many, the overall, yes, the monasteries were devastated under communism. Priests were massacred, shot. Lands obviously were appropriated. They became part of the common ownership starting in the Bolshevik times. All of those riches that the church had were taken, and some were destroyed and melted down, and the bells were melted down to get those things from. And we talk about that. And then we have a unit. I think it's Unit 8 coming up, or Unit 9. Unit 9. One of those units, they'll be only about the Eastern Christian tradition through the lens of Russian Orthodox experience, Greek and Russian. So coming up, that'll be exciting for us to talk about that. But but some monasteries were allowed to continue. I mean, Russia was the acknowledged home of the Orthodox Eastern Christian Church, because remember, Byzantium had become Constantinople had become Istanbul, and so while you still have Mount Athos, which is the real spiritual home of Eastern Christianity, of the Orthodox or Eastern Christian world. The fact is, Mount Athos is no longer within a. I mean, there's been the centuries of political changes and ownership of that part of the world, and
Yeah.
so Moscow really was a critical center for Orthodoxy, and
Mm.
the main monastery there was St. Sergius Radonezh, which was renamed in Soviet times Zagorsk, which literally means outside of the city or on the edge of the city, kind of, sort of. And it continued to operate. I don't know in every year what circumstances. There's certain monasteries that were allowed to keep operating, but under very strict governmental control. And you can read about that. That is complicated stuff. But 70 years of orthodoxy surviving through 70 years of communism.
Wow.
That's the bottom line. And there's
Right.
all kinds of fallout from that now. I mean, that hasn't been that long ago. 91, today is 2014. Very different world. Vladimir Putin is openly Orthodox. Churches are opening and being rebuilt. Very different. But the people who were young in those days, say in the 70s, 80s, now they're older. There's a lot of discussion about all that. Oh, I didn't mean to go off onto all that, but
Well, it's my
unfortunately,
fault.
politics never quite leaves things alone, does it?
No, no, it doesn't. Well, and I mean, and I'm a child of the '80s. I grew up in the '80s, and it was big news. Everything Soviet, was in the news, and and so looking back, I'm saying, what happened to those monasteries? Because as you've mentioned in the course as well as today, we've seen that they are great preservers in scriptures and artwork, and they seem to be this well, even located on an island, but seem to be islands unto themselves where they've preserved, but then they're also producing, and that's one of the things that I guess few of us even talk about. Like you said, the cheeses and some maybe the wines or the what did you mention? Beeswax candles.
Well, surely all that things that have to be made and beautiful crafts
Yeah.
and crucifixes and metal work and embroidery and all of the things that are needed both for liturgical life, communal life, and also it's amazing the products that you can find that monasteries for centuries. Not to mention, as you say, the knowledge, the preservation of the scriptoria, which we'll be talking about a lot next week. We'll be talking about the production of manuscripts. We're setting that up not in this week's material, but a little bit more as in the next two classes, because as you know, that is really going to be a major work of monastic life, is the preservation of and copying of critical documents in both from the ancient world that will be preserved, and in the church books, the books of the church fathers, and the music and the notation of the music, as we're soon going to be picking up. Notated music, not just oral tradition, but written down, and that's a huge, that's just a huge change in Western European cultural thought, how it will respond to that. So it's exciting what's about to happen in this early sacred music course.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to next week. I'm looking forward to the next chapter in the course, and I think this is a good time that we could just go ahead and I appreciate what you've done today, and we'll go ahead and close and wait till next week. How's
Well,
that?
I'm glad that you've enjoyed this material.
Yeah.
I'm glad that some of the statements that have really I think they do strike a chord. Whenever we can be sort of quiet enough to listen to people who spend their lives quietly listening to God.
Yeah. Wow. Well, again, thank you, Professor Carol, and thank you if you are viewing this on YouTube or if you're here with us live. Just make sure that you go to the website and join the Facebook as well, Professor Carol Facebook, and drop her a line, let her know what's going on, let her know that you enjoy this course as well as the other courses. We have America's Artistic Legacy, which we'll be talking about later on today as well. That's also a great course that I have enjoyed, and many more. There on professorcarol.com. Become a Circle of Scholars member there. It's one of the best. I have to say it's a bargain, but it's rich because what you get there is some of the best stuff out there for homeschool families, but also for just anyone who's seeking to learn these things about our rich artistic culture. So go to the website and join us next time when we have a talk like this here on Google Hangouts. And I guess that's it, Professor Carol.
See you next time.
All right, see you next week.